tell me about your dad. Like, what did he do? What kind of man was he?
When I gave my Oscar speech and mentioned my dad, I was looking way back. And keep in mind that back in the 60s and 70s, there really wasn't any access for deaf people. You know, a lot of audiologists and doctors didn't know what to do with when deaf babies were born. And so when my parents found out I was deaf, they did not know what to do. And I'm so grateful to that specific doctor who encouraged them to learn sign language and make sure that they could communicate with their deaf child. And so they ended up putting me in a school for the deaf, and that was my first exposure to ASL. And at that time, my father took the time to learn. And what I learned at school, I would come home and teach my father. And my father learned sign. Mom, Dad, I love you. You know, milk, hamburger, food, I want to play. And we'd go back and forth and learn this language together. You know, I didn't pay attention until I was much older. And looking back, I remember that I was in a baseball league with all hearing kids. And my father was watching us interact, and he saw my isolation and loneliness because no one else signed. So my dad was trying to figure out how he could find a way that I could be involved. And so my father ended up becoming a head coach for our baseball team. And my father was hoping that him signing would influence the other kids, and they might pick up several signs. But the problem was that all these hearing kids, even I had friends over, but how can I communicate with their hearing parents? So my dad was thinking even further. So the following year, he reached out and he found that all of these deaf kids from my school, that we didn't all live in the same city. We were quite spread out all over the metropolitan Phoenix area. Some were in Phoenix, some were in different cities, some were in different counties. And so my dad looked for a center point to bring in all these deaf kids, and he set up a soccer team with all deaf kids. And so my dad found a deaf coach who coached us. And so my dad was watching, and then he learned a lot. And he saw how much I was enjoying interact with all these kids because we communicated in the same language. And he met these deaf kids' parents. Some were deaf, some were hearing, who had similar experiences. Then my dad all of a sudden had a support system for himself and these other hearing parents. And so I didn't really think about how that happened, but my dad did that. That was so beautiful of him to see and want what was best for me. And my father was an extremely busy man. He was a policeman, and he rose the ranks and eventually became the police chief. And he was extremely busy, but he still took the time to learn sign language. Over the years, my father taught me how to play golf. He took me fishing. He took me water skiing, and we did a lot of activities. And so I have so many memories, and I'll always have those memories. But my dad was so supportive. And he asked me if I would consider having a cochlear implant. And I said, hey, you know, I've never thought of that before. No thanks. And the following year, he asked me again. And I said, no, you know, I'm fine. I don't need it. This is who I am. I'm deaf. And I understood that he was a bit worried about my future because of communication, because there's so many hearing people out there in the world. And my dad was thinking ahead and a bit worried. And then 2 months before I graduated high school, someone let me know that my father was in a car accident. He was hit by a drunk driver. And my father was brought to the hospital, and the doctor let us know he's going to die in 2 days. And that night, we just freaked out. We were so emotional. I was upset. I was angry. And I'll never forget jumping in the car and driving through the night into an alley, you know, where they put out the trash cans. And I was so emotional. I was just punching the roof of the car, driving through these alleys, knocking into trash cans. And I came to a stop, and I parked in an empty parking lot that was closed at night. And I just burst into tears. I was so upset that that had happened to my father. And I remember falling down into my knees there in the asphalt of the parking lot, and just seeing the droplets of rain. It began to rain. And at that moment, I feel like God was sharing his tears with me. So I got back in my car and drove back to the hospital. just to say goodbye to my father. So I got to the hospital, and it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. And the doctor told me, an interpreter did show up. And so it was a friend of mine from school who knew my situation. So he was there to support us. So he said, hey, your father's improving. And the infection is reducing. And we were surprised. It was like a miracle. We were like, really? And we were so relieved that our father was still alive. And he kept on going for 16 years, but he was paralyzed from the neck down. And so he had 7 bones that had been broken in his spine that he could no longer walk and could no longer sign. So that forced us as a family to adapt. And it was an emotional struggle to go through, and I wasn't used to seeing my father at home for months at a time. You know, he didn't show up at my graduation speech at my high school, but my brother filmed it. He filmed my speech, and the next day, my brother brought the VHS. You remember those VHS tapes from back then? And he stuck it into the VCR, and my father was in the hospital, and he watched my speech, and he just burst into tears. He almost just fell apart. He was so proud of me. And we made it through. And one thing I'd like to add is that my little brother, when he was 4 years old and I was 7, he accidentally fell into our swimming pool and could not swim. And so it caused severe brain damage, but he was still alive, the drowning. And so they brought him to the hospital, and they found we had to stay in the hospital because he needed life support through machines. And so every Sunday for the following years, every single Sunday, we went to the hospital, we picked up my brother, we brought him into the back of our car we had pillows and blankets set up, and I sat in the back and held my brother, and we'd go home, and we'd bring him to be with the family every single Sunday. And my parents and my brothers were chatting with him and just socialized with him all day, and we had to bring him back to the hospital. Every single Sunday, we made that commute when I was growing up. And so looking back at my dad, you know, now you might understand why my dad is my hero. He did so much. And I'm so lucky and so grateful to have had such a great dad growing up. I'm so fortunate. And I remember after high school, I stayed with my family and took care of my father, helped feed him. My father couldn't feed himself. We'd have to feed him. And so we had this long straw that he could use, and I'd fill up his cup. I'd drive him places. We'd go see movies. I'd change his clothes. I'd put him onto his bed, and there was all these machines. And I remember one day my father was sitting there and said, "Troy, you need to go. We have enough family members here who can take care of me. Don't worry, you need to go." And I wasn't quite ready to go. I said, "I wanted to be near you, you know." And he said, "No, Troy, you'll be fine." I said, "Okay." He said, "I want you to go into the real world and have these life experiences and follow your heart and follow your spark and see where that takes you." And so I let go, and I went to Gallaudet University. I went to NTID. I worked at Sunshine 2 Theater Company. I was on tour. I worked in all these different theaters. I moved to California at Deaf West Theater. I was in these productions for so many years, and that led me to who I became, and so here I am. And so looking back, now you might understand why my dad was so important to me and why he's my hero. You know, me looking at myself as deaf, being deaf was nothing. To see what my father went through, my dad couldn't play golf, I can play golf. My father couldn't go on a boat, I could. I can drive, my dad couldn't drive. And looking at myself, being deaf, so what? That taught me to be confident in myself and my attitude. I didn't care what people thought about me. And my dad didn't care what people thought about how he looked sitting in his wheelchairs, because it wasn't pretty. His hands were kind of completely flat. He couldn't bend his fingers. And so I saw his courage. And that reminded me to be confident in myself and to be brave. And that's why I learned so much from my dad.